Listeners, about healing, I believe sometimes it isn't just about finding the right therapist or the right words. It's about finding the right language for your pain. And that language often comes from our culture, from faith, from the rituals that raised us, even the ones that hurt us. And across the world, what we call recovery wears many faces. In some homes, it is prayer. In others, it is silence. In others, still, it's a secret. While spirituality can be a source of comfort, it can also build walls that keep us asking for help. In today's episode of the Cosmic Confluence podcast, I'm your host, and as always, we are going to dive deep into this very intersection of belief, identity, and healing with someone who has lived it and also led it. Tiffiney Randle is a behavioral health leader, a change maker, and a survivor. Someone who's walked through her own struggles with addiction and now leads others through theirs. She reminds us that healing isn't linear and it's never one size fits all. So let's try to explore what happens when our cultures, our faith, our healing, they all meet at the crossroads. So Tiffany, welcome to the show, and it's really an honor to have you here with us.
Thank you for having me.
Super. I think this is such a beautiful topic that we are going to talk about. Something that often kind of gets romanticized, but I think the actual essence of it may get overlooked. It's prone to get overlooked. So, beginning with the culture and the perception of healing, Tiffany, in many cultures, addiction isn't seen as an illness. It is seen as a failure, a weakness, or even a punishment. From your experiences, how do cultural narratives shape how people seek help or don't?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think everything you just highlighted in terms of belief system, cultural norms, from a spiritual standpoint, or even a moral standpoint, when individuals are struggling behaviorally, whether that be mental health or substance abuse, in many spiritual practices, the idea of possession, evil spirit, or a punishment is often the causation that's given. And in my own experiences, my family's a very, very deep in Christianity, and that is my faith to this day. But that was the belief that if you suffered with some of these behavioral health ailments, it was due to some spiritual deficit, or again, it was punishment for sin. And what that has led to in both my own personal life and what I see in the clients that I have served over the last 25 years, it causes people to suffer in silence for a very long time. Because with that stigma and with that belief system, silence is also encouraged, right? And so if you're having feelings of depression or anxiety, or you either have a chemical dependency addiction or even a process addiction, you suffer in silence and you're quiet about it. And unfortunately, the addiction or the suffering takes root and has a way of hijacking your life. And for some people, it goes very far. And so what we find in that is a lot of shame. And shame is one of the very things that keep people sick for a very long time. That shame and that guilt, it hijacks the person, and they don't seek treatment. They don't seek help. And again, I've seen that not only in my own personal experience, but in those we observed.
No, I absolutely agree with you. It's it's kind of what the reality is. And also when medical models here, Tiffany, when they clash with the cultural or faith-based worldviews. I mean, how do you bridge that gap, without invalidating someone's belief system? Because it can be very easy to kind of, be entirely, completely dismissive. And it's kind of quite a difficult terrain to navigate.
Absolutely. Such a great question. I think we have to first honor in many communities and many cultures, people do have, for whatever reason, whatever their personal experiences are, they do not trust managed care systems, whether, they've had some bad experiences or the history of our managed care systems. And I think one of the things that Cenikor really, really stands on is the fact that there's no wrong way to recovery. And so when people enter care and we do what's called a treatment plan or service plan, it has to be so individualized, right? I remember when I was going through school and they would teach us about treatment planning, it talked about all the different formal supports that we needed to put in place in that discharge planning, whether it be going to an outside therapist or seeing a psychiatrist. And I remember going to a seminar so many years ago, and I was introduced to something that was so obvious, but it wasn't in kind of in the school of thought at the time, was that we would also incorporate that they would find a church home, that they would set up therapy or counseling with their church pastor, that they would meet with their rabbi, right? And so we had to really step back and understand there's this whole person, there's this whole being that has a spiritual part of who they are, they have this physical part of who they are, and part of that recovery journey is incorporating that, because that's really what recovery is, right? Is that we find our whole self again. Recovery is not just about no longer picking up the drug. It's finding the best version of ourself that was lost in the battle of addiction. And the other idea of addiction being a disease was like not heard of, and that helping people understand from a medical standpoint, because you are suffering medically doesn't mean your spirituality goes away. It just simply means that there's some interventions that will help you guide again back to that whole person. And so to answer your question, it's really sitting down and asking them and understanding what their recovery looks like. What does their wholeness look like? How do they know? How would they know that they're meeting their goals for recovery? What would be in your life? What would you gain back? What would you lose? And answering those kind of questions will help us incorporate their beliefs, their ideas. Because if we lean in like we used to, because I used to be that therapist that I would lean in with everything that I thought and I was taught was real recovery, and I'm air quoting, right? But if we first become respectfully curious, asking questions with permission, and allowing us to learn who the client is and who they want to be, they should be the way, is really where we can reduce this idea of almost inserting what we think is their recovery. They should, and we say this all the time in treatment, is that people are really the experts of their own lives. I think where we come in as interventionists, as behavioral health professionals, we're really the facilitator of that, but they're really leading the way, and we become the mirror. So this is who you want to be. These are some choices you've made that may be not in alignment with that, but how do we get you back there? And they lead the way in that. So I think that's one important element of ensuring that we don't use those medical interventions or those traditional therapies in replacement of who the client is, by asking those, again, respectfully curious questions.
That is really, really interesting. And I think it's almost like pain is getting described, not only in just one language, but then there is a whole this blending of science and spirit into it, and honoring our background, our cultures, our traditions as well. Absolutely, because hold a meaning in there.
Yeah, yeah. I agree. I remember we had a client, and I just happened to come across the conversation. And this particular client, her spiritual practices included, she grew up using language like casting out the devil or casting out spirits.
Mm.
And I can't remember the denomination, but it was Christian. And this was really true to her. There's a scripture she quoted that some things you can't overcome, but by way of praying and fasting. And she would kind of ruminate on that scripture and this idea that she needed to see her pastor to go through this kind of spiritual cleansing. And I remember the professional that was helping her had assigned that to psychosis, that, that these beliefs are out of this world and she must be having a mental health breakdown. And so as we kind of, again, and we have this thing in behavioral health where we call it cultural competency. And I remember when that term came about, it was this idea that somehow you can learn about all the different cultural norms and ideas and somehow incorporate it into treatment. And I think we soon found out that that's just not possible, right? But instead of becoming culturally competent, we become culturally curious. And so when we have situations like that, and I have a client that's speaking the language that you refer to that I am not familiar with, or not within my worldview, then my job is not to assign meaning to it without becoming curious first. So if I have a client that's speaking this language that I'm not familiar, my responsibility is to ask probing questions. Well, tell me about that practice. Tell me how it worked for you before. And I think in those conversations, we arrive to this understanding of the client, that when this client says, I need to meet with my pastor to pray out these demons, she really believes, and this is her belief system, that part of her recovery journey is is spiritual cleansing. And whether we believe it or not, whether we have evidence of its effectiveness, that is who the client is spiritually, and that becomes part of her plan of recovery. That's how she finds wholeness. And so I think, again, there's no way we can learn about everyone's, because there's even subcultures within cultures. So the moment you think you understand who people are, there's a segment that's very different. And the only way we can stay abreast to that, the only way that we can be responsive to that, rather, is, again, constantly realizing how much we don't know about humans and asking the question with each of our clients and never assuming, right? So yeah, those are the practices that we really promote within our facility and just in my practice in general.
Yeah, I think and I think it's also a very. I believe that sometimes faith also gives people a lifeline, but then at the same time it can also kind of weigh down heavily, with the guilt. And I think this tension, it feels like where the real work it begins.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. I can, if I just speak to my lived experience, it's this, and just conversations we had within our community spiritually, in terms of if we are using outside intervention, it was this idea that our faith in our God, in our higher power, was low. That, I mean, even from a medical sense, I grew up in households where, we didn't go to the doctor because, God was our healer. We wouldn't take medication as prescribed because our faith was greater in our God than it was in the prescribed medication. And that is a real belief for people just in general, even in behavioral health, even in substance abuse and recovery, and even mental illness. I can think of, just in my mind, of watching family members suffer with mental illness. And our remedy at the time was to pray it away. And I'm not denouncing any of that. I think that's all effective. There's actually evidence that suggests that people who have faith in something greater than themselves tend to have better outcomes, even if it's just because the hopefulness has a way of healing our bodies naturally. So there's room and space for spiritual beliefs. But I think with that education, helping people understand that these worlds can kind of parallel each other, where the guilt of, if I take this medication, if I go to this treatment center if I follow the advice of this doctor, is that communicating that I don't have faith in my higher power? I don't have faith in in my spiritual practices, and it's creating the education of, for me as a Christian, I referred to biblical contexts where there were interventionists, there were practices that people use and still were able to practice their faith. And so I think what we aim to do is create education, validate the concern, validate the guilt, but helping them maybe broaden their understanding, and then they would make an informed decision on whether or not that intervention aligns with their spiritual beliefs. Because there are still people like, I'd rather do this. For example, in a lot of treatment centers, we have what's called the Big Book. And in the Big Book, they refer to God as a higher power. And there are some clients that prefer to refer to their God in a different name, right? And then we honor that. And so even in our treatment facility, you can see someone reading a big book, you can see someone reading the Quran, you can see someone reading the Bible. And we even allow them to openly share scriptures from whatever book that they find guidance from. And so I think when we have these conversations, it's so important to give space for them to practice in a way that makes them feel comfortable, and refer to their higher power in the terms in which they choose. And when you're in a communal treatment environment, you can be afraid that, they're going to offend this person, they're going to offend this person. But part of recovery is embracing, even the diversity around us and this radical acceptance of other people. And so I think there's just this very multi-layer thing when it comes to these conversations of how can I seek out outside interventions in a way that I am still honoring who I am spiritually. And I don't think there's any cookie cutter to that. I think it's going to be very individualized, and it's going to be very person-centered.
Exactly. And kind of it really, really sounds very, it's kind of an exception. I mean, especially these days, Tiffany, and I think we can easily get polarized or argumentative about different belief systems, whether it's culture or subcultures or religion or faith or even the very existence of something. But I think that's how the humanity, it thrives. Before we wrap up, I know we do have a time constraint, but I think this is a very important aspect here of healing is, that so much of addiction and trauma, it gets passed down, sometimes just genetically, but emotionally. How, do you think that the younger generations, they're breaking those patterns or just hiding the same pain in new ways?
I smile as you say that. I think we're in the age of information. And I actually was having this very conversation with someone the other day. I think how we grew up, like I'm from the 80s, 90s era, and the access to information was very limited. So you're very limited to your sphere of influence, right? You're around your family, your friends, your community, and you absorb the same of that messaging, right? And so what you believe is constantly reinforced with the environment around you. But as now we have the internet and we have Facebook and TikTok and all these different media platforms that exposes you to so much information. Now, definitely it has its drawbacks, don't get me wrong. But the fact that this younger generation has now access to information, they have something to ping their beliefs against. I believe this, and I'm hearing a different belief. And they're able to have this very healthy curiosity of other ways of thinking. And I always tell people, don't be afraid of that, because if what you believe is what you believe, new information will either get you curious to think differently or just reinforce what you believe to be true. And so I do believe that this younger generation are more open-minded. I'm hearing more language assigned to mental health. I'm not hearing, people are more open in talking about depression. You even see that in males, whereas a time that males would not talk about these type of things. And so even in our treatment center, we have more males now entering treatment than women. And so I think the information age is allowing people to be exposed to diversity of thought, and it's helping them to seek out more than what they were raised to believe. You know, even my own children, I am just so impressed with them. I have two sons. And when I talk to them, they're able to give language to their emotion. They're able to say, I think, you know, my son says, my oldest says, I'm going to go in for a tune-up. And that just means he's going to see his therapist and just talk about some stuff as he transitions to manhood. And so I'm just so proud that we can use very open dialogue without shame and guilt about, hey, this is kind of what I'm going through right now, and I'm going to get the help that I need. And I definitely, again, to kind of wrap up the answer to your question is yes. I think information in that sense has been really good for the younger generation to have more information to make critical decisions about their own mental health.
Exactly. I think this is that silver lining, in the dark cloud. That often would love to talk more about, more about the platforms or information, but I think somewhere down the line we often kind of overlook the good it is doing. That's
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. So, Tiffany, before we wrap up, if listeners they would like to explore more about the work that you are doing, they would like to connect with you, they would like to share their thoughts from this conversation, what would be the best way?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, so Tiffiney Randle, I work for Cenikor Foundation. We're all across the state of Texas. But if you are curious about treatment, have questions about what we do, you want to hear more about what we talked about today, I can be emailed at trandle@cenikor.org, and I will spell that out. So that's T as in Tom. Randle is spelled Randle at Cenikor.org. And if you just want to come in for treatment and want to find out how you can qualify and come in, I'm open to an email. Reach out to me, please.
Super. Listeners, what I'll do for all of you is I'll have all the details in the show notes. They will be attached along with this episode on whichever platform you listen to your podcast to. And I think, Tiffany, what we discussed today, I think it really makes clear that healing is more than just a diagnosis. It is a dialogue, it is a conversation between where we come from and who we are becoming. So thank you so much for sharing your story, your insight, and your reminder that recovery isn't about perfection. It's about that permission.
Absolutely.
Super, super. And to all the listeners, thank you for tuning into this episode on Cosmic Confluence. Until next time, take what resonates, question what doesn't, and keep finding your language for healing. Thank you.